Hello guys, Dylan Cologne, and welcome to another exciting video tutorial from PhotoThink. Today we're going to be talking about automatic selection methods. Previously we talked about uniform coverage tools and some of those manual selection methods where you painted your own selections into place. The automatic selection tools are kind of a natural evolution of these tools, and they do work pretty well when things get a little tricky in your selections. So let's jump right in with the magnetic lasso tool. It's the evolution of the lasso tool, and it works pretty interestingly. Basically, what you're doing is you're clicking and just not dragging, but just kind of painting your selection, and Photoshop is guessing where the edges are that you need to select. Don't have to be exact, it's just kind of doing all this guesswork for you. You close that selection, and there it is. Not perfect, but it did it pretty quickly. It grabbed those edges really nicely up here where the contrast between this area and the sky was pretty strong. It's not really good at picking out those small details, but we can fix that. These edges over here we had some trouble with. We're going to talk about fixing that in a later tutorial. Now, a very important thing to remember with the magnetic lasso tool, it can be a little finicky with your selections. You're going to see me paint a quick one here. Go around, and let's say I go around a few times and then I lose track of my start point and I create this crazy selection trying to find that start point. If you ever want to exit your selection, you just hit escape and your selection is deleted. That simple. Alternatively, if I created a whole bunch of points here and suddenly I realize, oh no, Photoshop, what did you do? I could just hit delete and it'll start bringing me back down to my original point. Very cool little tip for this tool. So let's continue just goofing around with this thing just for a little bit longer. Now that I'm done doing that, I'm going to deselect that. We have these options up here. These options did exist in the previous tools we used, but I just never explained them. I'm going to have a separate video explaining all of this stuff, but I might as well touch on it right now before we go ahead. Feather is soft edges, so I'm going to do some stuff here that might be a little weird and outlandish for the time being until we talk about layers, but I just want to demonstrate this to you. 0 pixels right now in Feather, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to do another one now, but this time at, if I could select it, let's say 60 pixels. I'm going to select all that junk again, close that selection, and you can see that for some reason these edges are soft. Now you're not going to see why until I do this. Okay. The first selection I did at 0 pixel Feather is hard edges all around. Now, the second selection I did at 60 pixels Feather, you see that it's kind of soft and fading out on those edges. That's what Feather is. It's telling Photoshop, hey, over the course of 60 pixels, start softening things out until it hits the edge where I want it to be entirely transparent. That's pretty cool. I'm going to set that back to 0 pixels for the time being, though. Width is the distance from the edge that your cursor separates from, where Photoshop will determine where to place the selection. So if I am 10 pixels away from this thing, it's not going to understand to place it there. However, once I'm within that 10 pixel boundary that's set up in that settings, it's going to keep drawing that edge as best as it can. It still is going to kind of guess that I'm moving away, but it's not really going to go that far from the 10 pixels before it jumps to another edge. Contrast is, well, we haven't talked about contrast yet in image editing terms, but just think of it as the difference between two things, black and white, gray and gray. You know, 10% contrast means that, well, I want you to select edges that have a 10% difference in what's between the two. So as I'm selecting this edge, it's saying, oh, this area is really dark, this area is really bright, that must be an edge, let's select that. If I bump that up to 100, it needs 100% contrast for it to detect where edges are. If I bump that down to 0, my magic thingy is going to be scrambling all over the place trying to find edges. Frequency, don't worry about. I really have no idea what this number stands for, but all I understand is that it's the number of points it's placing down. I don't know what that 57 actually stands for because there isn't 57 points between any amount of distance, noticeable distance, and the setting gives you no tooltip to really explain exactly what that number stands for. I usually leave it at 57. I really have no use for changing it. Now, below the magnetic lasso tool, we also have these handy little things. Let's go over the infamous magic wand tool first. The magic wand tool is kind of like your magic brush. Let's say I wanted to select these clouds. I just click that, and it'll select that. Now, there's also some settings involved with the magic wand tool. Tolerance means the difference between two colors that it's willing to select. So if I have this set down to 0, all the Magic Wand tool is going to know to do is select colors that are exactly the same. I touch that, it selects 1 pixel because all the colors around it are a little different. Now, if I turn off this setting called Contiguous and select that, it's probably going to select a whole bunch of stuff all over the place that match that color, but that's not what we want. So let's turn Contiguous back on, and now we're going to bump this up to 5. If I select this, it's going to select all the colors that are near each other that are around the same within a 5-unit tolerance. If I turn off Contiguous and select that, now it's going to select things all over the picture that match this. The points don't have to be touching. Anti-aliasing, just leave on. There's really no point to touching it. Now, if I bump this up to 80 and turn Contiguous off and select that, you're going to see it select a whole bunch of stuff. And that's because now it's selecting things that relatively match this color, but don't exactly match it perfectly. And that is a pretty good representation of what tolerance is. So let's bring that back to 5 and deselect that. Now we also have our quick selection tool, which the quick selection tool is kind of a paintbrush for selections. You just hold down left click and drag, and it'll start selecting things for you. It can be a little intensive sometimes, and your computer might slow down while you're doing this, but it's pretty cool just to watch Photoshop guess your selection for you. Now, there's this auto enhance option up here. I'm not going to talk about that yet because we haven't talked about masks, but this option can be pretty helpful sometimes. We also have this option right here where you can change the size, the hardness. The hardness is the reverse of feathering. So if I have hardness down to 25%, you could say that it's going to feather by 75%. Pretty cool. Now, these options are kind of new to us. So let's say I paint this thing over here and I'm like, oh, Photoshop, I didn't want that selected. Well, then I could click this minus thing and just kind of paint over that, and it'll start subtracting that from the selection. Now, you can also add to the selection with that selected, so I could just paint that right back in if I decide that I was going crazy and I actually want that selection. Now, as always, there are keyboard shortcuts for this, and these keyboard shortcuts are also universal to the rest of the selection tools. If I hold down Shift and start painting in a selection, it's going to start adding that selection in. If I hold down Alt and start selecting, it's going to start destroying that selection. Now, the best way to illustrate this is also with our uniform coverage tools we talked about before. You're going to see my crosshair develop a little negative sign there, and I'm just going to paint a square, and that square is subtracted from our current selection. And yes, you can mix and match all of our selection types that we've currently learned before. So if I hold down Shift now to add a selection in there, all of a sudden I'm adding one in. I could do the same with my polygonal lasso tool just by clicking a selection in place and holding down Shift, and that's added in. I could also hold down Alt and paint out with the polygonal lasso tool, which can be pretty cool when you're creating some weird selections. So that is about it. Quick recap: Magnetic Lasso paints a selection for you, but you have to draw your own lines. If you mess up, you just hit Escape as you're making that selection. We also have our quick selection tool for painting in our own selections and letting Photoshop do the guesswork within that painting. And finally, we have our Magic Wand tool, which is you click and you get your selection. Pretty cool. Now, there's much more to automated selections that I haven't covered yet. I'll cover those in a later tutorial, but I feel like it's important to talk about some other things before we get into that. Some of those really advanced automated tools are really helpful. They can do things that will really help you out in our later tutorials where we start talking about layers, masking, things like that. And those very intensive automated selection tools like Color Range can really make your workflow much easier. We're not talking about them yet because we haven't covered layers yet, nor have we covered some of the topics that are very important to how those tools actually work. Next up, we'll talk about some of those options and how they affect other selection types. Then we're going to jump into something called masks. A little weird, but you'll get the hang of them. Well, thank you so much for watching. This is Dylan Cologne from PhotoThink. Next tutorial is coming up soon.